rolling equity leasing.
I am
REL.
At REL, they're not just a leasing company.
We like to work with REL because
They seem to really care about us.
I am REL.
I am REL.
working with REL, it's a national company with a small town feel. REL.
REL.
I am REL.
I am REL.
I am REL.
We feel like we're working with friends. It's like you're having a beer with your buddy.
We are REL. Hi, everybody. John Haldi here, and I am delighted to have Tim Steiner with me. Tim, welcome.
Hey, John.
Tim is the director, the head of REL Solutions, encompassing all things maintenance, if you're just tuning in for this section of our series. Tim, today I would like to talk to you about money, which I love talking about. Not that I have much, but I love talking about it. I have heard stories about working with either dealer or local shops and getting bills back that are eye-popping.
Yes, sir.
So I want to understand from your experience and wisdom all about negotiating bills when you think that they warrant negotiation, right?
Right.
So if I could start with this one, when you get a bill back from a shop, how do you decide whether it's even worth negotiating, that there's an issue? How do you decide which ones are the ones that are worth your time or the effort and that kind of stuff?
Right. So this is a knowledge-based question. You kind of have to know what you're talking about, but a good indicator as a general rule is whenever it feels egregious, right? There's a history to these things, right? And the best thing that you can kind of do is to set your basis off of different vendors that you've had pay the jobs, right? If you've never done anything, at all, if you've never paid any invoice, then there's different pieces to this and there's different tools, right? You want to set a basis of expectation based off of what you know. So if a repair time is set, right, an SRT, standard repair time, are generally outlined between all the major components on the truck, right? If you're replacing an alternator, doing a water pump, these things have set time frames that they're expecting for each OEM based on the setup. And generally you can negotiate a very clean comeback based off of SRT times. Diagnostics are a very tricky thing to try and negotiate because that's generally saying they don't know what the issue is and it's a discovery period. So there's that one section. Then there's a parts section. Generally, you can find the cost of parts online. You have bought different parts before. You don't want too much of a major markup on your parts. And that generally doesn't really hurt anyone's feelings. That's one of the easiest places to get a concession whenever you're dealing with a vendor. So I would definitely start with SRT times and the parts. There's more that we can go into, but that's where I would start the basis of understanding.
And for my own clarification, are you saying SRP like Peter or SRT like time?
Standard repair time.
Standard repair time.
Yes.
And if I'm a new contractor, can I Google Volvo 860 fuel pump SRT and get something?
You generally can. There's different pieces, that there's so much variation when it comes to the different setups and all these things. You might not be able to find your exact piece, but you can generally find guidance that will let you know if you're way out of whack. And that's what we're looking for here. Small discrepancies aren't going to cost you too much. It's where it's egregious that you want to stand firm and you want to fight those things. And that's normally where you will get actual benefit.
Because I can imagine a guy like Steve Crawford, who's been in trucking all his life, he's probably seen every repair bill known to man, and he would probably joke and say, I remember back when the repair bills included feeding the horse, right? That's Steve. But if you're a newer contractor and it's the first time you've seen one of these things, I guess Googling it and or calling you maybe for a little quick advice, or getting on the Facebook group for the line haul contractors saying, hey, can anybody tell me if this is a reasonable amount of time? If you're new, I would think that that's a big thing that you need to invest your time on, and maybe keep a notebook so that you know what these things are as you see them.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of place to start, keeping a notebook so you can start to try and track these. But I go for a much easier approach first. I would be polite and I would just ask them, the dealership or whoever's doing your work, what is this, standard repair time? What is that? Get them to kind of admit their culpability first, and then it gives you a real quick pathway to resolution. Well, if you're saying this is an hour and a half, curious why you have 2.5 hours on here for this line for this job. Is there anything that we can do to work on that? And generally, it leads to a pathway that's both constructive and non-finger pointing. You're giving them the evidence that they are kind of, stabbing themselves with.
Okay. So go right to them and say, what is your SRT on this?
This SRTs are set ahead of time. It's a standardized portion for the industry, right? So all dealerships of like vehicles are going to have the same SRT times across the board. Their labor rates will make the bills appear different, but the SRT should be the same.
Okay. And a shop's going to have a labor rate, and that's what it is, and they'll tell you before you do the work. So if they say $85 an hour, you should expect 85. If it says 125, you have a question, right?
Yeah, if we're talking dealerships, I would put a 1 in front of that 85, but yes.
I'm making up numbers. I've never had a truck repaired. Please don't take my advice for anything. I'm just saying that's a number you should get ahead of time beforehand. What's your labor rate, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, 100%. I think it's a great piece of information gathering. And the more steps you take proactively, the less liberties people will take with your invoice, ironically. So if you call and you say, hey, I have this going on, I'm curious if you could take a look at it. If it ends up being the alternator, what is your SRT, on an alternator? And can you please tell me your door rate? And those things will generally get you a very concise bill.
Okay. So going back, you talked about diagnostics, which is, we don't know what the issue is. Very hard to argue that, right? Because they're trying to figure it out. But if you go in for an oil change and there's 6 hours of diagnostics, that's a red flag, right?
Absolutely.
Then there's the repair time, the labor, and then there's the parts, you said.
Yep.
Where should we go next in my learning how to read these things and figure out when red flags are up?
So that's another great question. Parts are a very clean piece because generally the people who are selling the parts aren't the parts department. The parts department is who gets their feelings hurt, right? Much like the mechanics in the shop, when you start to argue their time into a job, it turns into a personal work thing, right? If you ask the service department, say, hey, I noticed that your part is this much. Is there any margin that you can cut me a break on? And when you ask very concisely on large parts that are OEM based, if you're at the dealership, that's generally where you will get concessions. There's parts that are very common that have third-party replacements, airbags, shocks, different things like that. Those generally get whittled down due to competition. There might be some there for you, but it's not going to be the big wins you're hoping for. It's going to be very minor margin. The water pumps, the big parts that you're going to buy from the OEM, that's where you're going to see a lot of margin, and your ability to kind of take off a few $100s right off the top will really benefit you.
Okay. So in your experience, is there a ballpark for where, is it a size of the bill that would, it always depends on the amount of work done, right? But how do you go, wow, I need to call and dig into this? Or is it every bill you dig into?
So you should pay attention to every bill, but think about it on a percentage return. If I'm going to get 5% knocked off this bill, is it worth my time to have this argument over a $600 bill, right? When it turns into a $5,000 bill, a $6,000 bill, that small percentage starts to turn into very real dollars that you can gain back. And then it becomes worth your time. You want to pay attention to everything to make sure it's not egregious, but where you really want to whittle down is where there is a lot of work happening. That's generally where you can, make your largest impact.
And what's the best way in your experience to approach a shop to have that conversation?
So generally I would talk to somebody higher up. The service advisor is very good at deflecting. They use their positional restraints a lot as excuses to not handle your request. Don't be afraid to talk to the service manager. Don't be afraid to escalate things. As long as your tone is appropriate, these people will talk to you, they'll work with you. And if you don't have an accusational tone, if you come polite and with a request, you're far better off. I know a lot of people like to hardball and say they're not taking advantage of me, but then it creates a standoff versus a partnership. And it's much easier to coerce somebody than it is to force them.
Is the approach different if it's your regular shop as opposed to the truck was across country and they're 2,000 miles from home and you may never see them again?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. I think When you're not going to see them again, it's very hard to make a large impact on the invoice. It's going to be a difficult thing. They don't anticipate seeing you back. They're not fighting for any future business. When you have somebody who's closer to you that you feed a lot of business, that also becomes a negotiating tool. Hey, I spent this much with you guys last month. This one seems egregious. I haven't, I've paid all these bills directly. I've never negotiated them. This one bothers me. What can we do? That's a relationship that you can cultivate, and you will generally get more consistently. These guys who are remote, you want to worry about your work being done accurately and swiftly. Price generally is on the backside of those things.
When you're dealing with a remote shop, how much do quotes come in and estimates and approval before the work's done? Or is that not a thing? You need the work done regardless. How does that work?
So each vendor is going to be different, but a lot of them are going to follow your lead, right? In my solution center, we're very forthcoming with expectations. Hey, this is what we want you to look at. Take a look at these things because of what we're seeing on our side, and then let us know after that point. We authorize every step of the way. And the more you can interject in these things, the more control you will have over the course of the repair. If you just say, hey, here's my truck, fix it, at the end, you will see a very large invoice. The work's already done. They're on to other stuff. It's best for them to just kind of keep the invoice where it's at and let you go, disgruntled. Versus I'm waiting on approval. He doesn't want to approve it for this amount. I want to get this truck done. It's in my bay. Okay, not a few $100s off the invoice. Let's get this approved. Let's get this work done.
Okay, so your biggest lever for remote stuff is to require authorization before anything gets done.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that can stop bad steps from happening. It's much more difficult to negotiate a resolution once it's done versus coming up with an optimal result.
And when you're working with a local shop, do you give them more latitude?
1000%. Yep. You generally work together a little bit. You start to know each other's tolerances. And after a few invoices, especially contentious ones, you really see who you're working with. And once you get a feel for that shop, you can loosen the reins because there's more work to come. There's new ways to make these things up. Hey, you took advantage of me on this one. Can you help me out on this one? There's repeat work and different paths of resolution that you can, generally have with these local shops. So it's a little bit easier to give them a little more room to work.
So in terms of the relationship and how it impacts bills, lots of business obviously helps.
Absolutely.
Right? Repeat customer. What about flexibility to say, hey, I need PM work done. I can bring it on a slower day. Does that give you a little bit of a lever to go back and say, can you help me back?
Generally not with price, but it will help you overall with your business cost, right? We had talked about downing trucks, stacking these PMs. That's kind of where you will see the cost savings is in the downtime. Coming in at optimal times doesn't necessarily help you out on the invoice. We have to stay concise on what we're asking, right? And it's generally because of too high of, labor margins where they're trying to cover a discovery that they didn't quite ask you for, or the parts markup, right? So we kind of want to stay in our sections when we're negotiating invoices.
What about payment terms? What about paying promptly, like within 6 days as opposed to net 30 or net 45? Does that help at all?
That you can, but that's more of a hardball tactic, right? Hey, I know you did the work. If you want your money this quick, I'll give you X amount, right? If you want your money 100%, I'll give it to you over this amount. You can play those games, but that almost creates a resilience on the other side of the table whenever you're negotiating with people. These shops operate at a very heavy cost, so the money coming in helps offset their outgoing, right? So the parts that they have to have, their inventory, all these different things. Not only are they putting the part on your truck and then waiting for the bill, they're ordering another one to resupply their stock. So they need the money, right? So you can do that negotiation. That absolutely is a thing that you can lever if you choose to, but the way I prefer to do business is straightforward per the job and then cutting negotiated rates based on volume after the fact.
Okay. But generally speaking, if you can pay promptly, it puts you in a better light with these guys because they know they're not going to fight for the bill. after.
Yep, 100%. Certain shops won't let you go without paying the bill. But I think the way you geared the question was more towards, a working relationship where they're going to consistently see you. They'll let you go type of deal. So you can do that. But just make sure you're picking your battles.
Gotcha. What else? What are the other things when you're thinking about negotiating bills that I haven't asked you? Because this is all new to me.
One thing I would recommend is a review of your total spend, right? So don't let your spend go to the wayside and like, okay, I saved a few dollars here, I'm good now. Calculate that, bring that to the negotiating table ahead of time. Say, hey, last year I spent this much money with you. I think I can spend more money with you, but I'm going to need a little help, right? I have this much business to give in this market. Do you want this consistently? If the answer is still yes, can you help me out a little bit with, say, this much of a labor discount? Or can you knock off a general 2% on your parts, right? There's different pieces that you can kind of negotiate. So it's a per invoice negotiation and then a vendor relationship negotiation where you reference your total spend.
If you were a TSP and you had 12 trucks in an area and you tended to take them to the same dealer and or local shop, what would be the cadence that you would have in terms of when you would stop into the shop to talk to the service manager to have that review? Annually, twice a year, 3-4 times a year? What would be your desire for that kind of?
I think annually kind of hits the mark because you have to be cautious of a few different things, right? There's going to be warranty changes that are going to happen at dealerships. Different structure that's going to come down yearly from the OEM that dealerships are going to have to carry. So it can change volume, the market can change. There's a lot of different things that can adjust. You don't want to, hassle people by saying, oh, here they are again, for a negotiation. Once a year is a pretty, it sets you up. You can say, hey, this is what I did last year. Here's what I'd like to see this year. Let's meet again at this time. And then you can kind of ride those timeframes out. If you accelerate it, then you're trying to kind of capitalize on individual timeframes in the market. Those deals will only be good for so long.
Gotcha. But is it nice to stop in personally instead of just sending the truck and say hello and bring a?
No, that's actually a really great tip. FaceTime is one of the most important things at these dealerships. Everyone gets calls. There's lots of remote management. I mean, that's what we do, right? We call and we let you know. We have different levers to kind of pull if it doesn't go as appropriately. But whenever we can go and see the dealership and actually talk to them and we put a face, behind everything, it makes it much more personable. They're not just saying, no to say like a telemarketer, right? It's almost like, hey, your buddy Jim called you and now you're saying no to him. It's a different thing altogether. It puts a much more personal touch, and just generally the type of people that work at dealerships work better when they know you. You know what I mean? That personal touch is not lost. Very similar to sales. Knowing the person carries a giant difference throughout the whole process.
I know that bringing a pizza or bringing donuts is a no-no to the terminal for the terminal staff in the FedEx world, but do you think it's a good idea to periodically show up with coffee and donuts for the guys in the shop and say hello? And
that is an absolutely fantastic suggestion. And what you will see is actually a whole different sort of outcome, right? Because the techs and everything tell the service advisors what to put on the bill, and that's kind of how it gets formed. If you start to form that relationship with the base layer, you're going to have to fight less and less as it permeates up through the company until it populates on your invoice. Not only that, they're going to start to care a little bit more about your truck. Hey, man, this guy actually brought me in a pizza, and he brings in coffee. I don't want to look this guy in the face and say, hey, sorry, I broke your truck after you paid me, $180 an hour to repair it. It's a very different feel, and not to mention, it's just a unique way to stand out. They don't get it as much as they used to. As a former tech, I can personally tell you it makes a huge difference.
And I would think that in those moments where if they stick around an extra half hour, they get your truck done today instead of tomorrow, that could be worth a lot to you, certainly more than some donuts.
Substantially. And not only that, you can reference it, right? Now you have something believable. I brought you in the pizza, I brought you in the coffee, I brought you in these things. Hey, if you can get my truck out today, you're getting pizza for everybody in a week, right? And then you can start to gamify these things, and that leverage just keeps going and going and going. That personal touch can't be replaced by the negotiations that you and I talked about earlier. This is actually a very, very large piece when you're working with a local vendor.
Gotcha. And I would think the guys in the shop at a dealer, same thing. They eat pizza, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's if you can go and talk to these people and you can form that personal relationship, you are doing yourself a world of good.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, Tim, as always, a fountain of knowledge. I'm so grateful. For folks watching, I'm trying my best to think of questions that could be useful. If you think of questions that we haven't touched on, please email Tim. We're going to have his contact info here on the bottom of the screen. Email me, we'll have my info. But this whole series is about learning from Tim, and pop your questions in. It's too cumbersome to do webinars, so this is the way we've got to do it. But he wants to teach us, so thank you a million times over, Tim, for that.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. And I would like to hear from some people. It's great having a conversation with you, John, but any input that we can get, it'd be nice to, kind of see what everyone is thinking.
Very nice way of saying you're sick of me.
Thanks, buddy. It's always a pleasure talking to you, man.
Until next time. Thanks, Tim.
Yep.